Hi, and welcome to today's podcast. I'm Samuel Fitzpatrick, host and director of the Michiganders podcast, and this is our guest.
Tom Trombley. I'm Vice President and Chief Historian at the Castle Museum of Saginaw County History.
All right, and before we start, I just want to make a disclaimer. It's a little echoey in the room we're in. We're in a post office exhibit in the museum, so there's a lot of acoustics in the room. It's kind of a big room with a tall ceiling that I'm sure you'll see through some B-roll. So if we sound echoey, I apologize. That is why. And as always, first few minutes of the podcast, I turn the mic over to our guest and kind of tell us about who you are, your background, what you do, and what you like, in any order you want. So.
I'll kind of do this randomly, Sam.
Sure.
I do a little bit of everything at the Castle Museum. I really support our other staff members, and of course, I'm passionate about Saginaw County history. Saginaw County has a very rich and very varied history. I have been at the museum for just under 10 years. It's going on the 10th year now. Mm-hmm. And I had been here actually in the 80s as well. I have been curator of collections. I have a degree in history and political science, which deals with just about everything I deal with. And I'm very interested in historic preservation, buildings, and history in general. And anything Saginaw, of course, not just anything Saginaw, I'm always interested how Saginaw fits into the rest of the state and regions and country's history, and really love sharing that with people and helping people discover the richness of the history of their community.
Excellent. Sounds like you really love your job, which I know you do, but for the viewer's sake, he does love his job. Yes. Speaking of historic preservation, we're actually 2 or 3 blocks away from the Charles Lee Mansion, which is being done by Alex Mixter, who was our last podcast guest. So shout out to Alex for being a great guest. I'm actually going to go check out the house when we're done with this, just to see how it's coming along. All right, I'm going to move right along here. Let's see. Okay. So can you give us a brief history of Saginaw's history? Maybe Saginaw County history, not just
Saginaw
city?
County history, and I guess I need to do a brief disclaimer. We have some the sound of steam heating in the background. We do have climate control in parts of the building, but parts of the building are still heated by steam heat, which at this time of day decides to make a little bit of noise. Saginaw County's history is really a very rich and varied one. Of course, its history doesn't start with the European settlement of the area. It really starts with the Native Americans who have inhabited this area for thousands of years. And the reason why this area really and region has settled is because of the rivers are just really so important. The rivers were the transportation into the region. They provided resources, and I suppose the steam is supposed to be a background of that. Sorry about that. Anyhow, I'll start over on the river.
You're just hearing history. It's a very historical building.
It is, really. But the river system really, I think, is something that's so important. We're working on a new exhibit right now that really talks about what happened to Native American lives in the region with European settlement. And it really shows that overlapping of the river system and how it was transportation, a source for food. And when you look at maps of the area, that's really has so much to do with settlement and why Saginaw became a great lumbering center. Wasn't because it was in the midst of the forest, it's because the forest could be brought to Saginaw on the rivers to be cut into lumber. So there had been voyageurs who had gone through the area throughout the earlier history of the area, but really European settlement starts in the 1820s after the Treaty of 1819.
There's the Treaty of Saginaw.
The Treaty of Saginaw of 1819, thanks. And then the U.S. government constructed a fort on what is now the west side of the river, and the fort didn't last long. The soldiers who who had come here from Green Bay found the area not too inhabitable. Many of them contracted a form of malaria. Actually, several died in Saginaw, and that was abandoned, but the settlement wasn't forgotten. And throughout the first part of the 19th century, that's really the second quarter of the 19th century, the 1820s and 30s, there were various attempts to settle in the region, both in the farming areas outside the area, but also in what's now we know as the West Side, but what was at that time called Saginaw City. The first plat of that is in the 1820s, and another one in the 1830s. And there was a courthouse constructed in the late 1830s on the West Side. And then there were various attempts, including trying to dig a canal between to connect the Bad River. I can't talk without using my hands. Trying to connect the Bad River and the Maple River, which would have created an inland waterway across the state. That did not happen, but it's a really interesting chapter and one we're researching right now for our new exhibit.
Would that have been east-west?
It would have gone east-west and would have wouldn't have had to have gone around the straits of Mackinac to the north, but it would have used. It's kind of the time of the Erie Canal, so what would have happened about where where the Bad River is in St. Charles, you would have offloaded the steamships onto canal barges and gone across to Shiawassee County, Gratiot County, where you would have then again picked up steamships and gone across to out through Grand Rapids, out to the Great Lakes. And that didn't happen, but it didn't stop settlement. And really, there's various attempts in the night, various activity in the area, but really it's around the time of the Civil War that really national expansion created a demand for timber, and also really Saginaw blossomed as the great lumber center of the United States in the post-Civil War period. Actually, during the Civil War, if you would have left the city of Saginaw City or its rival city, East Saginaw, where we're located today, you would have discovered that the population between those two cities had more than doubled during the Civil War, and that growth would continue throughout the third quarter of the 19th century. And the peak lumbering years were in the early 1880s, and by the late 1880s, lumber had been exhausted. But the communities of Saginaw were surrounded by rich farming areas, and there also was a tremendous amount of capital, and it's at that time that leaders in the city, realizing that lumbering was not the future for the city, but knowing they didn't want to abandon this site, really started to try to develop alternate industries, and those included coal mining, which was, and it's so interesting when you look at some of those industries that were attracted or started in Saginaw, or brought here from other places to operate in Saginaw. One of the things that you note that they're really energy dependent, and the energy they were hoping to use and harness was coal. That led into, by the early 20th century, to Saginaw really becoming an industrial center. By the 1920s, really the major industry started to aligning with automotive production, and then of course General Motors became an important player in town. One of the products that was made here was the Saginaw steering gear, which was perfected. The steering column was gear was perfected here. Originally manufactured for the Buick plants. The Buick plants eventually, General Motors, as it grew and developed, acquired Saginaw steering gear. Also developed here were the world's largest malleable and gray iron foundries. And both during the World War I and then especially during World War II, Saginaw really became very important, important component in the arsenal of democracy. And one of the things that was made here during World War II was a machine gun. And part of the story of the machine guns that were made in Saginaw was not so much that a new design was developed here, but a way to manufacturing them, and really at a cost savings that was unimaginable.
So a new economical process to develop a machine gun.
And it's really interesting to look at how throughout that period, Saginaw was we were talking earlier about Saginaw being in the West and a place where people came, and throughout the 20th...
Well, for disclosure, West being Michigan in the
the
1800s, lumbering era was a lot like the Wild West that we think of as the Southwest United States. It was a lot of lawlessness, a lot of brothels, a lot of lumbering industries, a lot of...
and also really a place where you had a real chance to develop
yes.
and
a lot
make
of good
money.
things, not just the negative things, not
No.
just the dirty things, but yes, a lot of great things.
They were frontier towns.
Yes.
And with that, but one of the things that I think is easy to forget in the 19th century is, although Saginaw was a frontier town, it also was a major stop culturally for touring companies throughout the United States that stopped in Michigan. They would stop in Detroit, Grand Rapids, and then Saginaw. Saginaw was the third city of Michigan and remained that through the 1920s when Flint and Lansing eclipsed it in population. And also, it's really interesting in this quick podcast, we can't get into the incredible richness and diversity of the heritage of the people of Saginaw, but it's interesting to look how different industries, different activities attracted people from all over the country, all over the world to Saginaw to settle here, and to find a livelihood in the community. Really, Saginaw in the post-World War II period continued to be an automotive center. Of course, productions have changed over the years, and there has been a change in the number of people General Motors plants employed, being a major, and then the related industries. And at their peak years, it was well over 20,000 that were employed here in the automotive industry. Today, it's less than a quarter. It's about a quarter of that. And so it is a profoundly different employment in a profoundly readjusting future, one that the city has and the county has undergone many times. And it's interesting to see how things have changed, but have built on the past. Because I think not only do things change, but also what happened in the past really shapes the future. Definitely. And I think that's the thing. So an important thing to remember. So that is a very broad, sweeping, very quick view of Saginaw's history.
Just one question spinning off that. Now, with General Motors coming into the Saginaw area, didn't William Durant have a hand in that way back?
He did, and he is quoted as saying such things as, if Saginaw will take care of its housing and water problem, the General Motors, and the article is in his original quote, will invest in Saginaw. He was very involved in General Motors in Saginaw and the original development of the later development of the auto industry, because, and I say later because initially there had been several attempts to construct entire cars in Saginaw. They include one that we have on display in the lobby, the Saginaw Cycle Car, which was the little car, or $395 car that could do everything a $5,000 car would do. And since we have one and it's one of our most popular and treasured artifacts, I won't judge whether their advertising was accurate or not.
It's a real crowd pleaser.
It is a crowd pleaser.
Okay, so we're going to switch over to the actual building. It's a very, very interesting, intricate building. It's, as we were kind of chit-chatting earlier, it's really hard to miss. It's a beautiful Victorian building. It looks like a castle. But before it was a museum, it was the post office for the Saginaw area. Can you talk to us a little bit about the
certainly.
building?
I always love to talk about the castle building, which actually is modeled after a French chateau, not technically a country house, not technically a castle. So the story of the castle building is really very related to what we've talked about earlier about Saginaw being in a very important center. Saginaw was one of the things I glossed over, but originally there were two separate cities. There actually were more than that, but two major cities that were joined together in 1889 by an act of the state legislature. There was Saginaw City and East Saginaw where we're located. When the two cities were joined, neither gave up its federal post office, and the west side had a smaller post office, and however, the east side probably was a little more powerful in demanding that a new post office be constructed in the downtown area. And we were well represented in Congress through a former governor and a congressman in Washington. They were able to obtain a very good appropriation for a new public building in Saginaw. At that time, politics, as I said, I have a degree in political science. Politics is always important.
Politics and history go hand in hand.
They do. And even with design, they do. And at that time, all federal buildings were designed by one architectural office. It was called the Supervising Architect of the Treasury. The Supervising Architect of the Treasury was responsible for operating an office of draftsmen, actually designers, but at that time, all the works came out bearing the name of the Supervising Architect of the Treasury. Sometimes the Supervising Architect of the Treasury was more talented. Sometimes he was more of a political appointment. Fortunately, when Saginaw's appropriation came in, we had a person who was really quite talented and ran a very successful office, William Martin Aiken, who was from the South and was a very talented designer and also ran a very good office. And at that time, there's so many sub-stories here, but at that time, the government had a policy that federal buildings should reflect the heritage and climate of the city in which they were located. And you're going to wonder how, in less than 100 words, I'm going to say that relates to the design of this building. What happened was, to give an example, if a building was in the Southwest, they might select, this is the 1890s, and there's an interest in the past at that time, they might design a Spanish colonial style building. In the East, they might decide to design a colonial revival style building.
Like a British colonial?
Oh, no, an American colonial revival. So something, although Williamsburg hadn't been restored yet, thinking something kind of Williamsburgish, maybe Independence Hall in Philadelphia would be a Georgian style building.
Okay.
And then sometimes climate and landscape became the overriding concern. So if it was in the Rocky Mountains, and this is actually what they did, they show a post office with a very steep, uneven roof line suggesting the mountains in the background. Fortunately, what happened for Saginaw, William Martin Aiken found a book that talked about the French heritage and the French explorers and settlers in the Saginaw area in the 17th and 18th century. And also at that time, the chateau style or French Renaissance revival style was very popular. And so
this was part of New France.
That was,
yes.
And that goes definitely. So, it's that layers of history that come to surface. So he decided, or the Office of the Supervising Architect of the Treasury decided to go with the French Renaissance Revival or Chateau-style post office, which is not the most common style from a post office. There are a couple other post offices in the United States that kind of hint at this, but this is really, in many times, credited with being the only Chateau-style post office in the United States. And so that was the reason for designing the building in this style. The architect went further to say that the steep roof line on the exterior of the building was to shed the snow in the winter. And you've been in my office in the winter, and which is on the second floor of the building, and when it snows, it's off the roof almost immediately.
When the wind I think we also had quite some windy days and rainy days ramping up there, and we've had leaks and we've had to stop working because we had to shut windows and stuff.
Yeah, but we're in good. The building's in really good shape. Yes. But I mean, it is it is a very old building, and it requires we constantly maintain it. And it is, and every so often we do find water penetration, but not that common. Mm-hmm. But certainly the snow sheds a lot in the winter. And he also went even further to say the flora and fauna of the region suggests that the carving in the building, if you include photographs, or people come here to take a look at the building, I think they'll agree the owls along the eagles along the top of the roof line are found in this area. The plant life in the air, the carvings of flowers and leaf foliage, I think that we can pass. However, the mountain ram on the east tower, I really have never seen a mountain ram, and whatever is on the West Tower, I really don't ever want to see one. It's some type of almost mythological beast.
Gargoyle?
Yeah, well, it's not really. It doesn't really spout water, so it's technically not a gargoyle, but it's a gargoyle-like creature. It's really kind of creepy, but kind of wonderful. We like it very much, and it's really a wonderful detail. So originally there had been some apprehension locally about giving this property to the federal government, and there was a comment in the newspaper, the federal government never takes care of its buildings, so it isn't a very good idea. That, as soon as the building was completed, you can see in the newspapers that opinion changed radically. And the building quickly became a beloved landmark. Actually, and it's not on the camera, but people, and it still is, but we're building progressively on this story. If you look at a cabinet of souvenirs, we have a whole cabinet full of souvenirs, different items, plates, mugs, fans, and things that postcards that feature the building as the local landmark. And it's visible throughout the community. One would question if a chateau-style building was really the most efficient style for a post office. And one, as beautiful as the building is, I have a feeling that as a post office, it didn't function perfectly right from the beginning. And by the teens, because how mail was being delivered was changing, they were starting to use trucks and other things, and airmail's a little later, and we never had drops of airmail, although we do have a letter that was in the collection that was from the first airmail that left Saginaw. It was really and Saginaw was growing as a community, so it was bursting at its seams. So there were, in the teens and 20s, there were attempts to add on to the building, and they really weren't that successful neither aesthetically, nor were they that successful, I think, functionally. So what happened is, as the Depression hit in the 1930s, the federal government proposed constructing a new post office for East Saginaw, or for the city of Saginaw. And it was about this time the West Side Post Office, which stayed open as a separate post office for almost 30 years, for over 30 years after the two cities were joined, and supposedly was the only city outside of the United States. Saginaw was the only city in the United States outside of New York that had two separate post offices. And so in the 1930s, the government proposed constructing a new building. There was talk about finding a new site, although they wanted to keep it within the business district. Or the other choice was to demolish this building to construct a new building. And there was a public outcry. And after when
was this?
This was in the 1930s, 1934, 35, 36. And what happened was the government backed down and said and the compromise that was reached was that as long as the remodeling and expansion of this building created as many jobs as constructing a new building from the ground up would create, this is the midst of the Depression, that they would consider entertain the proposal of enlarging and remodeling the building, and that's what occurred. And in 1937, the building was rededicated, and that's the building you see today, which is over twice the size of the one that opened in 1898, excuse me, and it is very much a building of the 30s on the outside, on the Federal Street facade, the two towers and everything in between dates from 1898. Everything beyond that is really 1937. And when you're on Jefferson Avenue or the rear of the building, all of that is 1937. And when you walk around on the inside of the building, we have just a knock-dead lobby, I think. It's oak ceiling, travertine walls, the travertines from Colorado, because it had federal building, all the materials were supposed to come from the United States. And custom-made light fixtures, that's from 1937. The original lobby had a circular staircase. That remained but became a back staircase. And the building resumed its place after the remodeling as becoming as a landmark of downtown Saginaw. Actually, during World War II, the newspaper had photographs of a familiar site of Saginaw, and it appeared in Ripley's Believe It or Not.
Really?
And yeah, and
The TV show? Or
the newspaper column.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I always think of Ripley's Believe It and Not as simply being the newspaper column, not the TV show. I forget about that.
It was a TV
But
show.
It sure
for a
was.
while. I've been to the actual site in Florida. It's a very interesting building.
And I will say, in this case, it's the not is what you should emphasize, because they claim that the building is a stone-for-stone replica of Alexis de Tocqueville, the French philosopher, ancestral home, and that is not based in fact. And it doesn't.
What book did he write? Democracy in America?
Democracy in America.
I've studied him, but I did not know that there was a misconception that this was modeled after his.
And it is
I've
not.
Never come across
and I
that.
don't want to. I don't want to reawaken that story. It is not true. And de Tocqueville came to the United States, and when he was in Michigan,
came through Flint.
But he ended.
I did some work on him for my documentaries with Delta College. We had a little section on him and the guard bear he comes across somewhere in the Flint Saginaw region.
Yeah, well, and his far reaches of civilization that he looks for is Saginaw. So he goes beyond Flint. He comes to Saginaw.
Actually, they told him from what I read, he was in Pontiac. Yeah. And they told him beyond Pontiac is, there's a little place called Flint, and beyond that is, at this time in our state's history, was just wilderness for those people. Detroit wasn't even as large as it is today. It was much more frontiersy, as we were discussing earlier.
Yeah, and so he ended up in Saginaw, but that is not the reason why the building is designed in a French Renaissance revival style. Yeah. And so it functioned as Saginaw's main post office through the 1950s into the early 60s. And at that time, Saginaw was growing greatly and a new post office was needed. So a new post office was constructed on Washington Avenue. And behind us, I think our viewers will be able to see a giant seal of the post office symbol. And that originally graced the post office that opened in the 1960s in downtown on Washington Avenue in Saginaw. At that time, this building continued to function as a post office, but it was a substation. And it was at that time it was given the name Castle Substation, and it functioned as that until 1976. At that time, a new federal office building was constructed, and this building became was transferred to the county of Saginaw, which took it from the federal government. And in 1979, the Historical of Saginaw County opened a museum in the building. We have been supported by a countywide millage since the early 1990s, and since 1990 have occupied the entire building. So I think we're looking actually at 40 years, I'm using my fingers to count here, but I think for 40 years we've been
up. Below the table.
Yeah. For 40 years we've been in the building as the major tenant, and for a good portion of that as the sole tenant of the building. And the building has become the castle, known as the Castle Museum of Saginaw County History. And we were talking about earlier about the name. Actually, I was having a conversation with somebody else a little earlier about our name, the Castle Museum, which refers to the fact it was the Castle substation, and the county decided to keep that name when they took over the building and renamed it the Castle Building. We use the entire building, as I just said, and on the main floor, we have, of course, the historic lobby, which is a space we never alter. We do keep a few large items in it just to give a hint of what's beyond. And the space we're in is in what had been the major space in the building, a mail room, because really a post office is a building with one major public space, but then with offices and really a factory for sorting mail. And originally, much of our gallery space and our meeting room space was originally the mail sorting room. So this is a gallery we've created to give an idea of what these spaces would have looked like, which were just large open spaces with tall ceilings, nicely finished, but very industrial feeling. One of the kind of novel features of the building is that it is surrounded by observation galleries in what had been the workroom, and we have part of that
These
open.
are right behind us.
Yeah, and those would not have been at all accessible to the public originally. In fact, they were only accessible to the post office inspector, who was employed, who answered or was supervised by the main regional office, and was responsible for assuring the security of the mail. And the building was designed so he could enter or exit, and it usually was a male employee, that's why I'm using the male pronoun, but could enter or exit the building without being seen. And they were painted black, and there's little observation slits so you can look down on the floor. They're really kind of a neat detail of the building, and actually there's small holes in the floor so you can also hear the sounds and conversations on the floor below.
So what would they have been looking for?
They would have been looking for somebody, really one of the major things would have been things that were removed from the mail, especially when the building was constructed. A lot of people did not have checking accounts, sent cash. One of the things like parking tickets and stuff, you would put $3 in if you had a $3 fine, put it in the mail. It was easy. And it just assured honesty and integrity. And you never knew if you were being watched. I don't know that I'd want to work in a black, unlighted hallway all day, but...
and the only light you have is through the peephole.
Through the peephole and from below.
Now, would you have been alone up there? Would you have been there like a whole team?
No. It's one person, is my understanding.
Running back.
The post office inspector had several points where they could access the catwalks, so nobody really knew if they were up there or not. And the floors are covered with cork, so when you walk on the floor, it's very quiet. It's not. If I'm up there when we have visitors in the gallery, they know I'm up there because I'm too loud. But if you walk carefully, you can do it without being detected.
Easily spook someone.
You could, and that was part of the point. And I have been told by people who worked in the building, especially the last time when I worked in the building in the 80s, there were a lot of people still who would come in who had worked in the building, and they would tell about the post office inspector. And one person told me a story about one of his colleagues who wasn't honest and got caught. And so it's a really... there's several layers of history, many layers of history to the building. One of the things that's kind of interesting that defies common sense at first, but does when you look at it, that, this is a very tight urban lot. And even in 37, when they expanded the building, I'm certain they were really concerned about the amount of space that they had to create on this small lot. So how they handled package post was... packages went down to the basement to be sorted. Flat mail, letters, and postcards stayed on this floor, which always, if I had to lug them down to the basement, I think I'd want to do it the other way around. But there was a freight elevator right at the rear loading dock, and the mail started to go through. The area where we're in right now, I think this is where stamps were purchased. Okay. There's a vault behind us, and that vault was the stamp vault where the postal stamps were stored. So, in the museum, we have, of course, the history of the building, but we have so many other things. We have a changing exhibit right now. Currently, we have an exhibit on the Goodrich brothers, who were African-American photographers who came to Saginaw in 1862 and operated a studio till 1922. And they were incredibly gifted photographers who also were gifted at finding ways to take the views and market the views of things they wanted to take. And so we have a book right now on display that they did, the paid enlargements from a book called The Goodrich's Art Souvenir of Saginaw, Michigan, 1902. We have the Sports Hall of Fame on the lower level. We have an exhibit on archaeologists. We have a full-time archaeologist on staff. Lumbering, automotive manufacturing. We're right now working on coal mining that will include kind of a little immersive portion, which is walking through a coal mine. Mm-hmm. And then we're working on a new gallery devoted to the contact between Native Americans and European settlers, and that will open late this year. We have the interior of a jewelry store all the fixtures were made in Saginaw in 1914. All of the glass for the jewelry store was made in Saginaw. All the cabinets and mirrors, and they were made by the Saginaw Plate Glass Factory, which was in the teens, in the 19 teens, we're into a new century. I'm jading myself, was the largest plate glass factory in the state of Michigan. So Saginaw just really has a diverse, wonderful, rich history, and one that we find no shortage of things to explore at the museum.
So I want to switch over to some community outreach events or any public lectures that you guys put on, anything of that sort.
Well, we have throughout the year, we offer many things. Every Tuesday, we have Lunch and Learn, which is a lecture series at noon, and it's free with admission to the museum or free for our members. And our admission is really an overwhelming $1 for adults and 50 cents for children. And we're able to do that because we are supported by a countywide millage. And the lectures relate to various topics on Saginaw history. You can find a full schedule of that every month on our website, which is castlemuseum.org, or you can go to our Facebook page. And one of the events that we partner with our neighbors on is Jazz on Jefferson, which is coming up on June 5th. And it's a one-night event focusing on the resources of Saginaw's historic South Jefferson Avenue. The Castle Building, of course, I have a biased opinion for the Castle Building, but Jefferson Avenue has a number of just incredible buildings from the 1860s through the 1930s. We even have a house by Alden B. Dow that was constructed in the 1930s. So it's really a diverse and wonderful street, and just a place really to come and explore. When you come to the museum, you can also drive around or walk around and really look at some great buildings. Our neighbor to the south is Hoyt Public Library, dedicated in 1890.
Right next door.
Yeah, and they're doing a major restoration project right now, but it's a great building by a Boston architect, by Van Brunton Howe of Boston, and is constructed from Bayport stone from Michigan's Thumb in Bayport, Michigan.
Okay.
But what's interesting and why I bring up the stone, it actually was Saginaw developers who developed the quarry and also constructed a railroad into the Thumb in order to tap the resources of the adjoining area, both recreational and stone-wise. Well, but it was kind of the end of the timber period. So it's stone, coal, developing a resort, and just creating things to make the railroad work, and also to really open up that area for development. So it's just really fun to come down here and explore.
It is. It's a big, gorgeous building. If you guys are in downtown Saginaw and you want something cool to do, come on down to the Castle Museum. Again, you really can't miss it. Some people, if you're a Harry Potter fan, I know I've been told it looks like a Hogwarts castle. Well, that's it for me. I have a lot of questions, unless there's anything else you want to add or topics you want to discuss.
No, I think we've discussed on numerous things, and unless people are going to take a nap in between and start over, I think we'll call it quits. I can always go on. There's always new things to discover, and we change exhibits regularly, so there's always something new coming up. This summer, our special exhibit, the working title is On the River, and it deals with recreation on the river. Although the river was the lifeblood of the community, by the late 19th century, actually even earlier, it was used as a sort of recreation. There were houseboats on the river that were used for all sorts of purposes. Some of them...
Those were used up through the 1950s,
they were. And sometimes they were used for less than legitimate, for gambling, prostitution, and things. But also
Is that because on the river the laws don't extend?
Yeah, it was just a little. Yeah, I don't think it was
harder to bust.
Yeah, and it's even more complicated than that.
Okay.
But they were also used as cottages, and then during the Depression, they provided low-cost housing. So it's a very rich history. Some of it recreation, some of it more need, and then there were a couple of the lumbermen in Saginaw had private yachts, and we'll include the story of one of those, and also take it up to the more recent past and include the raft race that used to be held on the river. So it should be a really interesting exhibit to come to. So we'll have something new the next time you come.
All right. Well, sounds wonderful. Well, that wraps it up for today's podcast. Tune in next time with our new guest. We don't know who that'll be yet, but we'll make an announcement when we do. Tom, thanks.
Thanks.